Hello everyone, it's Ashley at the Silver Bay Public Library, and I am back once again with a wonderful read aloud for you guys. As we have been, we'll be reading A Single Shard by Linda Sue Park. There's only 3 more chapters left, so there's not much else to say. Let's find out what Trier has been up to on his way to Sangdo. And yeah, if you haven't seen me read the first 10 chapters, make sure to go back and check out those videos and listen to the beginning of the story. Or, if you don't want to hear me read, that's fine, but come pick up the book so you can read it yourself, because it's a great story. But anyway, let us dive right in. So without much further ado, we have chapter 11. The path to the Rock of the Falling Flowers was steep, and Tree-Ear leaned forward, sometimes on all fours, as he climbed. Just before he reached the top, he stopped by the side of the path and took the jjigae off his back. He drank from the gourd and poured a little water on his hands to splash on his sweaty face. Thus refreshed, he felt ready to give his full attention to the sight of the rock. He walked the last incline, holding the jjigae awkwardly in front of him, and set it down once he reached the broad plateau at the top. It was as if he stood alone on top of the world. He gazed around this way and that, hardly knowing where to look first. Before him, to the north, the cliff fell away sharply to the Kum River, a broad stroke of silver ribboning its way through the hills and plains. Behind him was the path he had climbed, with the city of Puyo below. How small it looked now. Tree-Ear shaded his eyes from the sun as it began to set, wondering if that smudge on the horizon might be the sea. Surely this cliff was high enough to see all the way there. Crane Man's words came to life. The king standing where Tree-Ear stood now, surrounded by the palace women, the enemy scrambling up the path he had just followed. The cries of the women, their terror, and then the sudden act of bravery, their colored dresses like the petals of 1,000 flowers. You know the story, eh? The voice at his side startled Tree-Ear. He felt his heart leap and run. He had not heard the man come up the path, but there he stood, poorly dressed and oddly pale, as if he had been ill for a long time or never went outdoors when the sun shone. Tree-Ear cleared his throat. "Greetings, sir. Have you eaten well today?" "Not today. Not for a few days now," came the impolite answer. The man smiled, but Tree-Ear did not like his smile. There was something unpleasant behind it. Although he would have preferred to stay at the rock a while longer, he decided to descend rather than remain in unwanted company. Tree-Ear turned and picked up his jjigae, preparing to hoist it to his back. "Let me help you with that," the man said, moving forward. "A fine load of rice indeed." Tree-Ear stepped back, trying to quell his alarm. His cargo was far more precious than rice. "Your offer is kind, good sir, but I need no help." The man's smile turned into a leer. "Now, there's a rude boy, my help is no good to you?" And he reached out with one arm to grab the jjigae. Tree-Ear jerked it away from him. He stumbled, coming dangerously near the edge of the cliff. The man snarled, menacing and ugly, and advanced a few steps. He seized the sides of the straw container with both hands and pulled. In the last moments, everything had come together in Tree-Ear's mind. The man's paler, his rudeness, his coming upon Tree-Ear in such a deserted place. He was one of the dreaded Turoknom, the bandits who hid throughout the countryside and on the outskirts of cities, emerging only to rob weary travelers. Tree-Ear held on the wooden frame of the jjigae with all his might. The robber pulled and jerked. Crane Man's solid straw work held. At one point, the man released one hand, cursing. The straw had cut into his palm. Tree-Ear's hands were toughened by calluses from axe and spade, his arms strengthened by endless work. He gave not a single step of ground to the robber. "Be careful!" a scream of warning sounded in Tree-Ear's head. "You are pulling so hard, if he lets go suddenly, you will fall. Move now, so your back is not to the cliff edge." Tree-Ear shifted his feet and began edging sideways. Still the robber pulled, now shouting curses and threats with every breath. Soon Tree-Ear's back was to the path. His hands and arm felt like iron. They would never break. He would never let go. The robber was weakening. He could feel it. Tree-Ear stared into the robber's face. Hatred would give him more strength, and it did too. Silently he swore to himself that this dog of a man would never win the jjigae with its priceless contents. The man stared back at him, his face contorted in an evil grimace. But suddenly he laughed and released the container. Tree-Ear collapsed backwards into the arms of another man who had stolen up the path behind him. A second robber. Against two, Tree-Ear could do nothing. The second man pinned his arms back while the first strode forward and wrenched the jjigae away. Tree Ear kicked and struggled, his head crashing into the chin of his captor, who swore in pain. The other robber reached out and slapped Tree Ear's face viciously. "Stop your struggle, worthless one," he said. "We mean only to rob you, but it would not be past us to harm you if you proved too much trouble." While his companion kept Tree Ear pinioned, the first robber quickly opened the straw container. He threw aside the packing of straw and silk, growing angrier with each handful. "Not rice? What is it you are carrying, idiot boy?" At last he drew out the first of the vase and his face grew purple with fury. "Useless!" he screamed, gripping the mouth of the vase with one hand and waving it about. Tree Ear caught his breath with fear. "We might sell it," said the second robber more calmly. "Have you no eyes in your head?" his companion shouted back. "Look at it. Can't you see? This could only be a gift for the palace. Nobody would dare buy it from us." "Keep looking. Perhaps there is something more." The robber set the first vase down on the ground and returned to his search of the container. With more muttered curses, he pulled out the second vessel and threw a final handful of straw on the ground. "Nothing!" he screamed. "All the way up this hill and nothing." His companion had shifted his grip and now had one arm across Tree Ear's throat, throttling him so he could barely breathe. With his other hand, he pawed roughly at Tree Ear's waist pouch. Here's something to cheer you up." He held the pouch in his free hand and emptied the contents onto the ground. The flintstones and the little clay turtle fell out, followed by the string of coins. "Something, anyway," grumbled the first robber, scooping up the coins. He kicked the jagay out of his way and headed down the path. "Come, we've wasted enough time here." Tree Ear breathed a silent prayer of thanks. "Take the money, take anything, just leave the vases alone." The second robber laughed. "Wait," he said. "Come hold this donkey for a moment." The first robber retraced his steps. "What is it?" he asked impatiently, grabbing Tree Ear by the arms from behind. "A little fun as long as we're here." The robber picked up one of the vases. He stepped to the edge of the cliff and flung it into the air. Peering over the edge, he put his hand to his ear in a pose of listening. After an agony of silence, the crash of pottery was heard on the rocks far below. The second robber laughed again. "One more," he said in a jovial voice. "No!" Tree Ear screamed, an inhuman screech of utter desperation. The robber holding him lifted him off his feet and slammed him to the ground so hard that his breath left him, and Tree Ear could only watch as the second vase sailed through the air. With a yelp like a wounded dog, he put his hands over his ears so he would not hear the crash. Tree Ear rolled onto his side and vomited. He retched again and again until his stomach felt as empty as his spirit. Shakily, he rose to his feet and bent over double, his hands on his knees. Failure, the most dishonorable failure. He had been unable to keep the vases safe. Julio was not even halfway to Songdo. If he had reached his destination and the work had been rejected by the court, at least he would have done his part. He raised his head slowly and stared at the edge of the cliff. He thought of returning to Min with this news, and his whole body shuddered. Nothing could be worse. He straightened up and took a few steps towards the edge. What would it be like to leap off and sail through the air as those women had, like flying, like a bird, so free? And time would feel different. Those few moments would feel like hours, surely. But just then he heard Crane Man's voice so clearly that he turned in surprise. Leaping into death is not the only way to show true courage. No one was there, of course. Tree Ear stepped back from the edge, ashamed. He knew it was true. It would take far more courage to face Min. He thought of his promise to Ajima, and besides, Crane Man was waiting for him. It was his duty to return. He picked up his waist pouch and put the flintstones and the turtle back inside. Then he untied the few items from the jagay. There was one pair of sandals. He had donned the other pair the day before. He had donned the other spare the day before. The food bag still held a few rice cakes, but Tree Ear felt that he would never be able to eat again. He tucked the pouch back under his tunic and slung the sandals, the food bag, and the drinking gourd over one shoulder. Then he stood for a few moments, staring at nothing. Gradually, the empty straw container came into focus before him. With a sudden cry of fury, Tree Ear picked up the jagay and threw it, container and all, over the edge of the cliff. He watched its descent. It did not fall cleanly to the water, but bounced several times off the rocks on its way down. Tree Ear turned and began to run. He ran blindly down the mountain path, heedless of the rocks and shrubs. Several times he fell, but was on his feet again in the next breath, stumbling, tripping, skidding in a headlong descent. When at last he reached the point where the path leveled out, he fell hard onto his face, the dirt mixing with the tears. His teeth cut into his top lip and he spat blood. The pain was welcome. He deserved far worse. Tree Ear sat up and wiped his face with the edge of his tunic, hearing nothing but the sound of his own panting and the rushing river nearby. Suddenly, a last flicker of hope flared within him. The second vase. He had not heard it crash. Perhaps it had fallen into the water. Perhaps it was still unbroken. Tree Ear made his way around the base of the cliff to the river. Boulders blocked the way to a narrow strip of sand, with more rocks beyond. He looked up the sheer face of the cliff as it rose far above him, and tried to guess where the vase might have fallen. Then he began scrambling over the boulders. Thorny shrubs grew among the rocks. Sometimes they massed into a wall so thick that he had to scramble down to the water's edge and wade to make further progress. If the vases had fallen among those shrubs, he would never be able to find them. That small mass on the sand ahead, not as dark as the rocks. Could that be a vase? Tree Ear made his awkward way over the stony ground, barking his shin once, but hardly feeling the pain in his eagerness. No, a pile of pebbles. For a long time, he made his way back and forth between the cliff and the river, up and down over the rocks and sand. He had nearly given up hope when he came upon a little mound of shards. They would never have been noticed by a casual passerby, so thoroughly smashed was the vessel that the fragments were no bigger than pebbles. Tree Ear crouched and touched them gingerly. The first vase, he hoped with all of his might. He stood and looked around. The thief had thrown both vases from the same spot on the cliff. The other one should be somewhere nearby. At the river's edge, Tree Ear saw something on the sand. He approached it slowly, telling himself it was probably another pile of pebbles or a piece of driftwood. It was the second vase. The force of its fall had driven it into the sand, into 100 pieces. Tree Ear dropped to his knees. Fool, he thought bitterly. Fool, to hope that it could have survived such a fall. The second vase, its fall cushioned, however, slightly by the sand, had broken into bigger pieces. The largest shard was the size of his palm. Tree Ear picked up this piece and swished it through the water to rinse off the sand. Across one side of the shard ran a shallow groove, evidence of the vase's melon shape. Part of an inlaid peony blossom with its stem and leaves twined along the groove, and the glaze still shone clear and pure, untouched by the violence that had just been done to it. A sharp edge of the shard bit into Tree Ear's palm. The pain was an echo. He remembered now. It was when he had thrown the shard from the first batch of ruined vases into the river of Chuopo. How long ago it seemed. Suddenly, Tree Ear raised his head. He stood up and squared his shoulders, still clutching onto the piece of pottery. He laid the shard carefully on a flat stone. He took the clay turtle from his waist pouch and squeezed it back into a ball. Next, he rolled the clay between his palms until it formed a long snake. Picked up the shard again, he pinched the snake all the way around the sharp edge to protect it. Tree Ear removed the flintstones from his waist pouch. They might scratch the shard. He tied them into one corner of his tunic, then put the clay-bound shard into the pouch. Holding the pouch clear of the boulders with one hand, he climbed back to the path. With his every movement was quick with purpose. To hesitate was to doubt. He had just made up his mind. He would journey on to Songdo and show the emissary the single shard. And that is where we'll end it for today. And now I think we know why the title of this book is A Single Shard. But thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. And there's only 2 chapters left, so we'll find out what the royals have to say about that single shard that Tree Ear is carrying. So check back again on Wednesday and Friday as we finish, and then we will start a new book next week. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.